I'm knelt before a fire on a crisp September night, with red all over my hands and a recurved bow slung over my shoulders. My offering lying at my feet as I echo out the special word at the top of my lungs. The intensity and volume of something very large and powerful blowing through the dense forest suddenly begins and grows closer and louder. Soon the crashing breaks into silence as I come eye to eye with it. I know what I have to do now. I need to fast forward you to a time in my life when I met and married Laura. Laura and I had known each other all throughout my college career. We hung out with mostly the same friends and usually at the same get-togethers. I say get-together because neither of us were much into the partying scene, so we spent our times respectively around even-keeled people who were more academic, you might say. Nothing too crazy happened around us. It wasn't until after college when I ran into Laura again at a Safeway in Oregon that something had kindled up between us. She was in town to oversee the surveys of a local timber company, and it just happened to decide that fateful evening to take a chance on grocery store sushi to take back to her hotel room. I, on the other hand, was purchasing needle thread, citric acid, amongst a lot of other peculiar items for my projects at the cabin. Fortunately, Laura didn't notice these items in my cart, and we commenced with the usual "how have you been" conversation. Both of us, though, seemed locked on each other, and hung on others' every word. Like I said, we had essentially been geeks in college, so I never took notice of Laura in a physical way, given the usual Coke bottle glasses and the oversized Pokemon sweaters. Likewise, she would have had no reason to take notice of me either. I was 35 pounds overweight then, and usually wearing whatever I had for lunch in my sweats and worn-out Metallica shirts. To say that she had changed would be an understatement. She was wearing a very plain button-up blouse with blue jeans, but she had gotten rid of the big glasses for contacts, and her past, frazzled red hair was parted away finely so I could see her beautiful green eyes. I was entranced. Luckily, I myself had dropped the weight, had been involuntarily working out, given the profession that I was now in, and I had learned to eat like an adult and wear adult clothes. We ended up having a light coffee downtown that night. It seemed like there wasn't a thing she could say that I wasn't completely interested in hearing about, and she seemed evenly interested in my life, at least what I told her. When I walked her to her hotel room that night, neither of us expected anything physical, so there was a real sincere comfort between us as we exchanged numbers. I could ramble on and on about my life with Laura, but suffice to say, the rest was history. A short 8 months later, we found ourselves surrounded by friends and family on a beach off the East Coast, professing our undying vows to each other. Oddly enough though, my new bride, a Western Rockies native, had never seen the southern part of the United States, and insisted on a backpacking trip into the Appalachian Mountains. This is where our story really begins. We had elected to embark on a 20-mile hike that week. The idea was that it would provide exercise but also the ability to take our time being with each other. The first 4 miles flew by that afternoon, and as we came to a beautiful meadow with a bubbling stream running through it, we couldn't imagine a more picturesque place to camp. So we set up camp, cooked our freeze-dried meals, and headed to the tent early that night. At about 2 a.m., I could have sworn that I had heard voices on the hillside above us, but I was too tired to check it out before dozing off again. At 3:37 though, I knew that I was hearing something, so I gingerly snuck out of our sleeping bag, quietly unzipped a slot in the tent door, and took a peek towards where our campfire had been. I thought that I could make out the outline of 3 medium-built people, but what gave it away was the glow of a cigarette butt that was hanging out of one of their mouths. I found myself unsure of what to be prepared for. I had left my hunting gear at home for this trip, so all that remained for our protection was a can of bear spray and a multi-tool plier that featured a dinky knife blade. Honey, what's wrong? Laura had startled me with. Once I regained my composure, I took one last view out of the door to witness the figures in the dark scrambling away. Nothing, I said. Maybe a bear, but it's gone now. I didn't want to worry her over something I myself wasn't so sure about, so I snuggled back into our bag with her and fell asleep. The next morning, I took notice of 2 cigarette butts around our campfire. Something felt awry, but I was in my honeymoon after all, so I decided carrying on a few more miles down the trail would alleviate the worry. Late that afternoon, we had lingered our way into, like, Marker 7, when we had walked up on a very old and small-statured white-haired gentleman that was hunkered over off the side of the trail with a look of defeat worn on his face. He seemed quite out of place in a modern world with clothing that was stained, tattered and ripped everywhere, as though he had just finished working a coal mine in the 1800s. He was bent over in a semi-permanent way, but when he lifted his head towards us, his piercing blue eyes locked onto us in an almost hypnotizing way. Laura spoke up and asked if he needed help. He stated that he was in dire need of water, and that he had run out of energy and breath trying to get back to his cabin, 2 miles up the draw that we were passing. Immediately, Laura surrendered her aluminum water bottle, and I came alongside him, hooked his arm over my shoulder and gently eased him up the draw. A couple of hours later, we found ourselves standing before the most moss-covered ramshackle of a cabin that I had ever laid my eyes upon. Laura and I both looked concerned at each other as the man stepped away from my support, as though he had never needed it, and bounced up the front steps of the cabin's little squeaky porch. "Thank you too kindly for escorting me home and taking care of an old man. I should be okay from here." He then gave Laura's bottle back to her and with a wink said, "If you two ever need anything, just holler my name and I'll come a-running. My name's Atlul." I think he could read our minds as we pondered the logic in leaving an old man deep in the woods in such awful-looking living conditions. So he gently waved us away while turning his back to us and walking through his front door. "Are you sure we can't help you with anything else?" I half shouted. He poked his head out the door and replied, "Oh, trust me, I'll get by just fine. From time to time I make friends with fine folks like yourselves, and they bring me by some offering of whitetail venison in the fall. 1 or 2 deer always meets my needs the way that I am right now." And then he winked again like old men do, and popped his head back inside the old shack as he slammed the half-rotted out wooden door. As we made our way back to the main trail, we asked ourselves both the logistics of an old man living on a national forest, and what kind of name Atlul was. We soon made it to Marker 8 and settled into a quaint little opening on an overlooking hillside of the trail. We once again headed to bed before dark. Around 4 a.m. the following morning, I took a step outside to relieve myself when I noticed 3 fresh cigarette butts a mere 20 feet from our tent. At 6 a.m., I rustled Laura up and insisted that we start our hike early. She seemed confused but agreeable, so we left it at that. We ended up trekking 7 miles up the trail that day. Laura asked why we needed to push so hard, and I made a story up about having a surprise stop for her on our way back home to Oregon. Laura loves surprises, so she just gave me a glowing smile and we headed off to bed early once again. This time because we were actually exhausted and needed the rest. I felt secure that the distance that we had covered that day would clear us of the strangers. But at 1:30, we both started awake to the sound of an eerie whistling in the tree line 30 yards west of us, and it began emanating from all around. I knew that Laura needed to know what had been happening, so I whispered the whole gambit to her, and she in turn verbally berated me and smacked my shoulder as I grabbed for my little multi-tool knife. Before I could even get the knife open, the tent door was ripped apart, and 4 large and very rank-smelling men rushed us. They stood there staring and hunkered over us. "They'll do just fine," The largest of them squeaked out with a low, hoarse voice. I quickly unfolded the blade and jabbed him in the female artery along his hip. He let out a howl and staggered back, taking my knife with him. It was then that I knew we were in real trouble and I was out of ideas. Before I could think any more on it, I felt a hard glance to my right temple and it was lights out. What must have been just 5 or so minutes later, I came to with my hand and mouth tied up, kneeling and looking across our rekindled fire, as 2 of the men began poking and prodding at Laura as they held her down together. To say that I had never felt so powerless and fearful in my life would be an understatement. I screamed with all my might through the dirtied cloth crammed in my mouth, and attempted to break free and ram myself into the man, watching guard over me, but to no avail. When I fell sideways in the dirt, I noticed that my blade had done its work on the larger man as he lay there, unconscious and bleeding out a few steps from our tent. Once I had heard the fabric of Laura's t-shirt begin to rip apart, I knew what this had all been about. My heart and hers were about to be shattered for eternity. She then locked eyes with me, screaming my name despite both of us truly knowing how useless I was in that moment. But then she did something quite unexpected. Somehow, within the recess of her mind, fired up a memory, and out of one more act of desperation, as the horrid man began clawing at her jeans, she yelled, "Atlo!" The men all stopped and stared at each other. What does that even mean, woman? They began to heckle us both about it. But then we heard the loud crash through the forest. Before any of us could register the noise any further, a bulldozer-like movement erupted through the clearing, and what appeared before us standing at neatly 8 feet tall defied all logic. It was definitely what you might consider the rough image of Bigfoot would be, overlong arms that hung nearly to his feet, except that 8-inch claws jutted out from his long-haired fingers instead of fingernails. He was obviously hairy all over with a sheen, silver-like hair, and of course, he had what appeared to be size 35 human-like hairy feet. But what would throw your whole perception of his build was that his head resembled more of that of a grizzly bear, with a shorter but deeply scarred snout. Scars that alluded to untold battles with beings even larger than himself. Still though, emanating through that terrific exterior were those piercing blue eyes that seemed to project a sense of ancient experience, kindness, and blind rage all at once. "What the?" was all one of the men could mutter before the thing leaped down on him, and in one foul motion, ripped the man apart with jagged teeth. The other men immediately began to take off in 2 separate directions, but the beast leapt from the first man onto another 40 feet away, and ripped the man open with both hands and began to feast on him. I thought for a moment that the final guy would make it out when he broke into the tree line, but our savior stopped snacking and seemed to reluctantly acknowledge that he had more work to do, and dashed with jaguar-like speeds into the woods. The screaming that we heard echo from there was the stuff of nightmares. Laura quickly ran over to me and untied my bindings. We eyed the main trail below us in unison, and began to stand up to make our escape. Stepping right out in front of us, though, was a frail old Atl, red all over his face and tans while licking his lips. "It's all okay now, kids," he quipped. "What was?" I started to stammer before Atlo interrupted me. "Some things are better left a little mysterious, eh?" He then took a survey around camp before adding, "You kids pack your camp up and head on a little ways down the trail. I'll clean this mess up myself." He gave us another one of those charming winks like jolly old men do, and we both nodded our heads in obedience. After we had packed our tent and gear up, while eyeing Atlo as he just stood a few feet away staring up into the stars, I voiced out a soft, "Thank you, sir." He turned slowly to me and simply replied, "You two are good folks, and I'll do anything for good folks. You ever find yourself in my part of the wilderness again, you just holler and I'll be there. Run along now." He then turned his back again to us and looked up at the stars while stretching his shoulders as though he had just awoken from some deep slumber. Laura and I didn't set camp anywhere else that night, obviously. Instead, we hiked the remaining 5 miles of our trip in the dark to the rental car staged in a trail parking lot that night, and drove nearly 200 miles before stopping at a hotel in another state to crash. In the following months, Laura and I both worked through feelings of defeat and shame over what nearly happened to her that night, but we learned to work through it together, and it bonded us closer than ever. It wasn't until the following August that Laura shook me awake in the middle of the night, because she had just remembered. Adlo kind of insinuated an offering, didn't he? I nodded to her and turned back to go back to sleep. I knew what I needed to do once hunting season came. And that's how I found myself in September, kneeling over a young buck whitetail and yelling for Atlo's name in the middle of the night. Once he had broke the tree line and appeared before me as the Yeti being, I had to stifle the inadvertent terror that I'm sure still showed clearly in my eyes. I question whether I had even blinked before the next thing I knew, there stood that small stature of a frail old man. "Thank you kindly for remembering my request, young man," he said. "There will be more where this came from, I assure you," I replied. And then he winked at me and turned away to look up at the stars, signifying that it was my time to leave.